What's good, folks, students, teachers, everybody in between? My name is Mr. Little. I want to welcome you to this here video. Now, we are about, give or take, 3.5 weeks away from most advanced placement exams starting here in the United States of America. And particular students I work with who take AP World, but this also applies to AP Euro and AP US, have lately been telling me that they are terrified, just terrified of the LEQ. That is the long essay question. Now, I, for the life of me, can't figure out why everyone's so scared of this thing, but I'm here to help you be a little less scared of the LEQ, if in fact that applies to you. So please stick around. So this video is going to cover a few things about the LEQ. So if you're looking for something very particular, if you just want to see me write an LEQ, if you want to see me break down an LEQ, check the timestamps. They'll tell you where everything is. So please see that if you have anything specific that you are looking for. So first things first, what even is the LEQ? Well, I'm going to have some information displayed right here. So the LEQ is the long essay question. It's the very last part of the AP exam. It is worth 15% of the exam, and you have about 40 minutes to write it. Now, technically, you could have more than 40 minutes since you have an hour and 40 minutes to write both the document-based question and the long essay question. So sometimes students ask, what are the differences between the LEQ and the DBQ? To which I would say, we're 7 months into an AP course. I sincerely hope you know that difference, but it's a genuinely confusing question. So there are a couple of key differences between the LEQ and the DBQ. Overall, the LEQ and the DBQ are actually really similar. The general structure of both essays is the same. You still need a contextualization statement. You still need a thesis statement, and complexity is still something that could be in play. So they're actually quite similar, but there are a few key differences. In fact, there's two really big fundamental key differences. What is the LEQ? The long essay question does not have documents, right? Which means you need to bring the evidence to the LEQ, which is what I think terrifies so many people. But hang on a second. I'm going to explain why you don't need to be afraid. And two, the historical thinking skill or the reasoning skill is a little bit different than the DBQ. So in the DBQ, most of the grade comes from the ability of you to analyze the documents. Can you read this document, comprehend it, use it to support an argument, and then deeply analyze that document? In the LEQ, it's different. In the LEQ, you are creating a narrative about general historical change, and you're going to analyze it using one of three particular historical thinking skills. That is change in continuity over time, causation, or comparison. All right, so here we have the LEQ rubric breakdown. So the LEQ is 6 points, unlike the DBQ, which is 7 points. However, most of these points are the exact same thing. So we got your thesis and claim, same thing. Contextualization, same thing. Your complexity over here, same thing, as well as your evidentiary points are structured very similarly, right? The only difference is now you're bringing the evidence, you're bringing the documents, if you will. You're not actually being provided them. So there is no reasoning point for analyzing the documents, nothing for hip, hap, cappy, whatever you call the statements where you do context, point of view, audience, or purpose. Instead, you have something called historical reasoning using one of the three historical thinking skills, which I already talked about. So that's the only real difference, right, between the LEQ and the DBQ. They're actually very, very similar. It's really just that how you structure the essay as a whole. Now, of course, every teacher has taught their class differently how to write an LEQ. I have one particular method. It's going to be linked down in the description below, so feel free to have a look at that. Just to be clear, though, this is the way I've taught my students to write the LEQ. Your teacher might have something very different. Now, a lot of students I've been talking to have been saying that they are terrified. They are afraid of the LEQ. And I can't figure out why, because honestly, apart from the SAQs, the LEQ may be the easiest part of this entire exam. Let me give you 3 reasons why you should stop being afraid of the LEQ. Number 1, you are more prepared for the LEQ than you are for any other part of the AP exam. Remember that it's the very last part of the exam, and therefore you've gone through everything else before even getting to this. Now, some people might say, oh, I'm going to be tired, I'm going to be out of energy. And yeah, you might be, but you know what else you've just done? You just had a whole review of everything this course has to offer. You've looked at least 10 stimulus in the multiple choice. You've looked at 2 or 3 stimulus in the SAQs. You've looked at 7 pieces of stimulus in the DBQ. You've been given a complete rundown of everything this course has to offer. So a lot of people think it's scary because they wouldn't know what to do. I would say flip it around. Think about it like this. You were more prepared for the LEQ than you were for any other part of the exam. The second reason why, because it's actually not that much evidence that you have to bring to the table. All right, what I've got here is I have the AP exam scoring guidelines, specifically for the LEQ, specifically for Part C, that's the evidence. Now, what a lot of students have told me is they are terrified. They're like, I don't know how I'm going to be able to come up with enough evidence for an LEQ. And my answer to this statement is, I understand your fear, but let's take a look at exactly how much evidence you have to bring to the table. So Provide specific examples of evidence that are relevant to the topic of the prompt, right? Not explaining what this evidence means, just what it is, right? If we look at the decision rules and scoring notes, responses that earn the point, two, literally just two pieces of historical evidence, right? Now, if you're telling me that you can't come up with two names, two places, two events, two pieces of technology, two states, you can't come up with at least two, well, my friend, you are in trouble indeed. That said, I know a lot of you are really, really smart. You got big brains. You've worked very hard. I am convinced. I am confident. I have faith that you can come up with at least two pieces of evidence. Versus in the DBQ, you had 7 pieces of evidence plus a piece of outside evidence you had to work with. Third reason why the LEQ is actually really easy is that you have a choice. You didn't have a choice with the DBQ. You barely had a choice with the SAQs, and you didn't have any choice with the multiple choice. Ironic that they call it that, right? Here I have the 2021 free response questions. These are specifically the LEQs. Now notice there are 3 of them here. You get to pick from these 3. You get to pick from these 3. So 1 from Unit 1 and 2, 1 from Unit 3 and 4, and 1 from, well, this is actually pretty much just Unit 7, but I mean, it's the time frame for Unit 7, 8, and 9. So you have a degree of choice that you don't have in a lot of other parts of this exam. So you can pick which of these you probably remember the best or the most, and then go ahead and write it. Now I'm going to give you a 4th piece of information why you should not be afraid of the LEQ, and it goes like this. The LEQ is worth 15% of the exam. You don't even need 100% to pass. Considering that based on previous exam numbers, you only need about 60% to pass. If you don't want to, you don't have to do the LEQ at all. Yeah, just skip it. Just don't do it. If you're beat and you're tired and you don't know any of those prompts, just don't do it. Now, I can't promise that will work in class. I'm pretty sure that won't work in class. But on the actual day of the exam, you have to make the judgment call. And if you feel really good about your multiple choice, really good about your SAQs, really good about your DBQs, just don't do it. Like, you can just not do it. You can declare yourself done and not do it. That said, if you are planning to do it, then I'm going to go ahead and write one full LEQ, see the timestamps. And I'm also going to write an LEQ for those who maybe are not entirely sure about their other parts of the exam, the multiple choice and the SAQ and the DBQ, but also don't really know what they're writing about. So I'm going to show you an example of how you can, so to speak, BS your way to a 3 out of 6. All right, so here we have the AP World LEQ prompt number 2 from the AP World exam in the year 2019. Now, I have modified this prompt a little bit because originally it was actually from the period 600 to 1450 CE, but we've tweaked that a little bit since 600 is no longer included in the course description. Let's break down the prompt real quick. So it says, in the period 1200 to 1450 CE, which means we're talking about units 1 and 2 here, trade networks, we should have a few in our brain right away, expanded and economic productive capacity increased. So this is, I think, a fancy way of saying trade and trade-related activities, such as agriculture and manufacturing. Technological innovations, okay, so we can think of quite a few of those, and transfers often contributed to this process. So it says, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which technological innovations or transfers led to increased economic growth in this period. Asking about how innovations or transfers, so that is new inventions or knowledge of new inventions, led to increased economic growth during this period. So brainstorming for this prompt, it just off the top of my head, when I think about trade networks, I think, of course, about the 3 big trade networks, such as the Silk Road, the Trans-Saharan route, as well as the Indian Ocean basin. Those would be the big 3. And so those, you should definitely have those kind of like locked on your brain when you hear the word trade networks, right? Those expanding, right? So we're talking about these sort of realms here. Now, technological innovations or transfers of said innovations means we're asking about inventions during this time that are really well known, knowledge of those innovations going somewhere else. Now, keep in mind that technology doesn't just refer to objects or inventions here. It can also refer to knowledge as well. So we might think about things like the spread of Hindi numerals to Europe. That's like the 1 through 10 system that we use now. Other innovations might include things such as paper technology. Other inventions might include things like gunpowder. Oh, and another big one would be the camel saddle, right? The camel saddle being popularized. So in thinking about how to respond to this prompt, these are just some of the things that have come to mind. And maybe watching this, you can think of some other ones, but this is just sort of our brainstorming. And it's always a great idea to do when you get the prompt, just do a little bit of brainstorming to figure out what it is that you want to write. All right, so first things first, I'm going to want to do is determine which of the historical thinking skills I want to use to respond to this prompt. Now, I could use any of them. I could use causation. I could use change and continuity over time, which I'm going to write CCOT, or I could use comparison. Now, whichever one of these I use, I'm going to still need to make sure I'm responding to the prompt. But I think what I'll do, which is what most students do, which is, relatively speaking, the easiest one, is I'm going to go ahead and use causation, simply explaining cause and effect, or in the case of trying to get the complexity point, explaining both a cause and an effect. So I'm going to go ahead and just use those. Now, I had all those examples out earlier, but because you really only need two, count them exactly, two pieces of evidence, I'm going to pick two of those examples that I'm going to go ahead and make an argument about. So the things that I think I'm going to stick with, I'm going to go with here would be the Hindi numerals going to Europe and the popularization of the camel saddle. I'm going to go with these two examples as my two sort of pieces of evidence. So I have my technological innovations and I need my increased economic growth. And this is important because you want to make sure you are always responding to all parts of the prompt. So how did Hindi numerals lead to economic growth? Well, those numbers made doing business easier because they were easier to understand. Right? That's going to be my argument in this case. Right? These numbers make doing business easier because they are easier to understand. Right? Now, I'll develop that argument a little bit, but here's just sort of my my baseline. Right? What about the camel saddle? Well, the camel saddle, that's going to lead to more business in part because this innovation means more goods can be carried by a camel. That's how each of these little technological innovations and transfers is going to lead to increased economic growth during this time period. And I'm going to argue a causation claim. So basically, I'm just going to demonstrate how this led to more economic growth. So before we go ahead and get too deep into the essay, let's establish what our thesis is going to be. Now, a thesis is very similar in the LEQ as it is to the DBQ. You simply need to establish at least one line of reasoning with one historically defensible example. So using the initial wording of the prompt, I'm going to say something like, in the period 1200 to 1450, technological innovations and transfers contributed to increased economic growth. Correct, that transfers right there. Contributed to increased economic growth. For example, the popularization of the camel saddle in the Sahara. Oops, I'm just making these little mistakes. Sahara increased the volume of trade and the increasing use of Hindi numerals in Europe made doing business there much easier. Period. So here I have my arguments. And as you can see, I've got my two examples, so to speak. I'm talking about my camel saddle, and I'm talking about Hindi numerals. So I have my two historically defensible examples. And increase the volume of trade. That's one line of argument. And made doing business much easier. That's a second line of argument. So a thesis has to have at least one of these things. In this case, I have two of each, but a regular good thesis has to have at least one of these because you are making an argument. You don't have to explain any of this stuff, but it does need to be present in your thesis. All right, so let's move on from the thesis and let's make sure we've got our thesis point down. But we still need a contextualization statement. Now, a lot of students struggle with context, and I know every teacher under the sun has a different way they teach it. I have a different way of teaching it. My colleagues have different ways of teaching it, and that can become very confusing. But all I want to tell you is that the contextualization statement should have at least two things. One is that it should be at least two sentences. It could be three, but it should be at least two. And two, it needs to put the prompt in its historical time frame. So in other words, it needs to discuss what's going on around the prompt, but not about the same things as the prompt. Now, this might include coming before the prompt. However, since this prompt is from Unit 1, unless you happen to know a lot about Unit 0, you might be out of luck there. However, that's okay. As long as you can talk about other things happening around the same time that have nothing to do with the prompt, that is an okay contextualization statement. So let's look up here, right? In the period 1200 to 1450, we're talking about trade networks, we're talking about technology, and we're talking about economic productivity. Now, it may sound like you're covering a lot, but that's only 2 out of the 6 course themes. They're not talking about religion. They're not talking about empire growth. They're not even talking about social changes or how we relate to the environment. So if you talk about any of those things, you'd be perfectly all right. So I'm thinking of 2 things in particular that are not directly about economic exchange, but do sort of set this prompt in in its time period, right? Kind of explain what's going on around the prompt. So one of those things would be the continued spread of the Islamic religion into Southeast Asia, in particular to Malacca, right? The city of Malacca, on the Malay Peninsula. So, right, so the continued spread of Islam to Malacca during this time period. In addition to that, I'm thinking about the rise of one particular empire, the rise of the Mongol Empire, which united much of Eurasia under one ruler. Fix that right there. So these are 2 events that are happening during that time period, 1200 to 1450 CE, but they don't necessarily have to do directly with technology and economic growth. You can make the connection, as I'm sure some of you are thinking about, the Mongols with their yam system or the Mongols encouraging trade on the Silk Road, but that's not how I'm going to argue it in the contextualization statement. So when you're planning your contextualization statement, my suggestion to you would be to think of 2 facts, 2 events, 2 things that are going on in the same time period, but don't have anything to do with the prompt. They're the different themes, right? We're not talking about economics. We're not talking about technology, right? 2 different themes. If the prompt says technology and economics, think about culture and politics or the environment. If you can do that, you'll be on a good place to go, even if you're not entirely sure about maybe what came before or what came after your prompt. Now, I like to tell my students to usually begin their contextualization statement with sort of a broad, overarching sentence that can cover a lot of things. It can be purposefully a little bit vague. So, for example, the time period 1200 to 1450 was a time of increasing connections, right? Something that's very broad, very general, right? But it says that you at least know a little bit about what was going on during this time period. I'm also mentioning increased connections because that is one of the things that economic growth did during this time period, was that it increasingly connected regions, right? But I'm just going to start with this very broad sentence. And I'm going to use one of my facts. I'm going to bring down this sentence. The Islamic religion continued its spread into Southeast Asia, in particular to Malacca. And in addition to that, comma, and then we'll just paste that other sentence, the rise of the Mongol Empire united much of Eurasia under one ruler for the first time, period. Now, some teachers want you to have a sort of transitionary sentence, which then says something about, like, in addition to these political and cultural changes, there was a great economic change afoot, or technology was also playing a part in uniting the region. But I'm going to go ahead and leave that off. That's technically not required by the College Board. And we'll head on down and we'll put together some paragraphs. So before we get into writing this first body paragraph, I want to really stress a reminder that you only need 2 very specific pieces of evidence in your LEQ, right? And since we're going to talk about Hindi numerals coming to Europe, and we're going to talk about the camel saddle being used in the Sahara Desert, those are pieces of information. So as much as it pains me to say this, I can kind of sort of flowery language my way through the rest of each of those paragraphs, as long as I make solid mention of the Hindi numerals and the camel saddle in the Sahara. This is just how it works. Again, I'd caution you before doing this in your own actual AP class. Your teachers might have a very different perspective on this than the AP readers do, but I'm going to go ahead and show you what a paragraph could, in theory, look like, as long as you have 2 of them. So we're going to first do the Hindi numerals. We're going to start with a topic sentence. So the introduction of the number system known as Hindi numerals made doing business easier in Europe during this time. All right, so there we go. We're going to talk about that. That'll be our nice topic sentence, kind of tell us what this paragraph is going to be about. We need to either explain how productivity increased as a consequence of those Hindi numerals, or how those Hindi numerals led to increased productivity. As Europe came out of the economic situation of the Middle Ages and began to trade more actively with the rest of Afro-Eurasia, They needed a system of doing business that was easy to understand. Increasing contacts with the Islamic world in Spain and the Crusades had introduced the 0 through 9 number system the Muslims had adopted from South Asia. So notice here I've introduced my fact here, right? We're talking about what the Hindi numerals are, that 0 through 9 number system, which Muslims had adopted from South Asia and was introduced to Europe via increasing contacts with the Islamic world in Spain and the Crusades. So I've set up what it is that I'm talking about. Now I need to explain how this led to increased economic activity. So that's going to be my next step. This system, known today as the Hindi numeral system, was widely adopted across Europe by the merchant class, right? So I've made my claim, and now I need to explain why, right? So, and this is how I recommend structuring your paragraphs in an LEQ: evidence, explanation, evidence, explanation, right? By the merchant class, in part because it was simple to use, but also in part because it was already in use by the Islamic world. The major trading partners of those European merchants. Right, so again, I have right here, we can see I have my piece of evidence, right? This 0 through 9 number system, that's the Hindi numerals. And then I have the explanation for how this potentially caused trade. So this would be the explanation, and this here would be the evidence. Now I've typed it a little bit over, like you could literally just say something like the 0 through 9 number system known as Hindi numerals. That would also be fine. But here we have our evidence, and here we have our explanation. So with that said, let's go ahead and get the next set of evidence and the next set of explanation. But bear in mind, since I've already given my one piece of evidence, I don't actually have to give anything super detailed or something that would qualify as evidence because I've technically already done that. So, but let's keep it going all the same. As a result of the adoption of this number system, the volume of trade goods from the Islamic world coming into Europe increased dramatically. Now, I could get specific here, and I could say something like Persian carpets and Turkish carpets in Renaissance paintings. I could talk about the spice trade from Egypt, but I'm not going to do any of that because technically I don't have to, right? Now, I know the historian and some of you might be screaming that this statement right here is a little bit too vague. And I would also argue, my professional historian in me would say that's way too vague. However, per College Board, you only need 2 specific pieces of evidence, right? But the Hindi numerals is the specific piece of evidence we're working with in this paragraph. As a result of the adoption of this number system, the volume of trade goods from the Islamic world coming into Europe increased dramatically. The adoption of this system made possible doing business easier at the major centers of the Islamic world because of a common system of accounting and keeping records, which made everyone involved want to do more business. Awesome. Again, I would argue that this is a little vague for my taste, but again, we've technically made an argument and we've provided an explanation. So again, we see this sort of easy chunk system, right? We have our evidence, right? Our evidence is that the increasing goods from the Islamic world came into Europe. And then our explanation is that the reason because of this is because of the ease of doing trade between 2 people using a common set of accounting and numbers. Now, you might recall that one of the differences between the DBQ and the LEQ is the need to demonstrate reasoning, that is either cause and consequence, change in continuity over time, or similarities and differences. Now, technically, I've demonstrated that there is a cause and a consequence, right? The event, that is the introduction of Hindi numerals, led to an increased volume of trade because they're easy and the Islamic world already used them, and therefore the Europeans would want to use it to be able to do more business, right? I've technically demonstrated that, but what I always tell my students, and what I'm going to tell you right here, is that to make it really clear to the reader, let's go ahead and put a sentence at the very bottom that simply says something like, therefore, the introduction of Hindi numerals into Europe led to an increase in the volume of trade with the Islamic world, period. Right? Just sort of really reiterating everything we've shown, a concluding sentence, if you will, that just sort of recaps everything we've been talking about. And with that said, we're done with paragraph number 1. All right, since I got our Hindi numerals paragraph out of the way, now we're going to go ahead and talk about the camel saddle. Now, what I'm going to do here is a little bit of a reverse of what I did in this first paragraph. Whereas in the first paragraph, I said that Hindi numerals led to increased trade. I'm now going to argue the opposite, that increased trade was the consequence or reverse of cause from the camel saddle, right? So I'm technically arguing the same thing, right? That this innovation led to increased trade, but I'm going to look at it from the opposite way, demonstrating a consequence, not a cause, and put me one step closer to that complexity point. Let's go ahead and type it out. The increasing trade along the Saharan caravan routes can be attributed to the camel saddle, period. Our first example, although it does not have to be super specific since we're already talking about the camel saddle, I'm going to say something like, during the period around 1200 to 1450, products from West Africa, such as salt and gold, were making their way across the Sahara in increasing volumes, right? Now, again, there's more goods from West Africa coming out of the Sahara during this time. Both North African Muslims and European and adventurers wrote stories about the legendary wealth of the kings of the rulers of West Africa, spawned by this increased trade. So I have our example of salt and gold making their way across the Sahara, and then sort of an explanation of this situation, talking about how North African Muslims and European adventurers wrote stories about this legendary wealth, just sort of explaining the situation as it was. The origins of this increased volume of trade can be attributed in part to the introduction of the camel saddle. All right, here's our second piece of evidence for the whole paper, right? The camel saddle, right? That's our second piece of evidence for the whole paper. That's all we need. This invention, which allowed for camels to carry more goods than if those goods were merely tied to the camel, meant that the volume of trade across the Sahara could increase by a great amount. We can take a little bit of liberty when we talk about volume and in terms of numbers. We can take a little bit of liberty here. I think it might be a good idea to give a little bit of time context. So the introduction of the camel saddle around the year 1200 CE. Now, in actuality, historians argue that it may have been introduced in other parts of Africa as early as like 800 to 1000 CE. But again, per College Board, we're just going to go ahead and put down that, it was introduced and popularized around the year 1200 CE, right? This invention allows camels to carry more goods than if those goods were merely tied to the camel, meant the volume of trade across the Sahara could increase by a great amount, and knowledge of the wealth of West Africa would be more well known, encouraging more merchants to make the journey to West Africa. All right, so I've just explained how the increasing trade across the Sahara can be attributed to the camel saddle, right? But as before, we should put it in a single sentence, kind of just wrap up everything we said. Therefore, the increasing volume of trade across the Sahara can be described as a consequence of the camel saddle. Right, and now I've just done one consequence paragraph where I've explained how this is a consequence, right? And we can see that simple sort of formula. So here is our sort of evidence. Here's our evidence number one. Here's our explanation, right? Our explanation here. Then we have our evidence number two, right? Talking about the camel saddle. And then we have our explanation number two, right? So we have evidence, explanation, right? Very simple way to keep in mind. Then we have our nice little concluding sentence in which we explain to sort of really reiterate, as you can see in this whole paragraph, we've demonstrated a consequence. Now, I'll be real with you. I don't know if this essay could get a complexity point based on the simplicity of the way that it's written. However, I'm going to go ahead and throw in a few things that I think might help make it more complex. So as some of you probably thought right away when I talked about how the camel saddle was introduced, you probably thought about how, in fact, the camel saddle was introduced by Islamic merchants, right? So I'm going to throw that in there. So one of the reasons for the increasing trade with North Africa was the search by Muslim merchants for sources of gold following the expansion of Islam into North Africa. Those same Muslim merchants introduced the camel saddle, right? So here I've pointed out that it's not just the camel saddle didn't get introduced in a vacuum, right? But that it was also part of the expansion of a religion, which is true. Muslim merchants did help popularize the camel saddle. So that's something to keep in mind. This is one way to make things more complex. I'm going to come back up here, right? And I'm going to point out, now this is also something I'm pulling from my own memory, and that is that the system that the Hindi numerals replaced, Roman numeral system, right? I, X, V, I, right? That system. The previous accounting system of Roman numerals was difficult to use in calculations because of how the numbers were structured. Unlike the 0 through 9 system. Right, so I've just incorporated a little bit of complex knowledge about the removal of Roman numerals. Now, I don't necessarily know if you'd have to know that, and there are many ways in which you could make this essay a little bit more complicated than it already is. This is just two ways that I'm doing it. I'm trying to show that not only have I demonstrated both a cause in the first paragraph and a consequence in the second paragraph, but I've thrown in a couple of extra bits of knowledge that might impress the reader. Overall, I would not encourage you to worry too much about the complexity point, just because it's so very difficult to get that you'd be better off just practicing formatting your essays overall. All right, so you have now seen the full completed DBQ. Let me now show you the 3 out of 6 DBQ. That is the DBQ that you could write if, for example, none of the 3 prompts seem to work for you, if you're just mentally burned out or tired, or if you just have no idea what you're doing and you're so disoriented at this point, but you just want to make sure you have a good chance of passing the exam. Let me show you the 3 out of 6 DBQ, real easy. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to keep our context statement and we're going to keep our thesis statement, because that's 2 points right there, right off the bat. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Most students at this point of the year know how to write a thesis with their eyes closed. At least I hope you do. But either way, again, you only need 1 line of reasoning. So for example, all we have to do really is we could take out this right here about Hindi numerals, and this would still count, right? In the time period, yada, yada, the popularization of the camel saddle increased the volume of trade. That's technically a line of reasoning and an argument. And therefore, if you would just have that sentence, that is technically a thesis. Technically, again, 1 point, 2 point. And then our third point is simply going to be our 2 pieces of evidence. So we're not even going to pretend to write a paragraph. We're just going to take A system known as Hindi numerals was widely adopted across Europe by the merchant class, period. Done. Piece of evidence, right? The increasing trade along Saharan caravan routes can be attributed to the camel saddle, right? I'm going to delete all that. The origins of this increased volume of trade can be attributed in part to the introduction of the camel saddle, right? Done. Delete all of that. And so there we go, 3 points, right? We have our context statement, we have our thesis statement, and we have our 2 pieces. We have 1, 2, and 3 out of 6. And therefore, as long as you do okay on the multiple choice, okay on the SAQs, and okay on the DBQ, and you're just so burnt out that you're not sure what to do in the LEQ, this could be a way to just make sure you've got a good chance of passing. Again, whether you do this is going to have to be up to you at your own discretion, but that is one way that you can easily sort of cut through and cut down an LEQ. Alrighty, well, I hope this video has been helpful. Click on the links in the description below if you want a close-up look at the documents that I've shown you here. But I want to thank you so much for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and best of luck on the AP exam.